By the spring of 1917, the Western Front had learned how to erase places. Hamlets vanished first, names rubbed out by shellfire and rain, then replaced with grid references. Roads followed. Finally, the maps themselves grew sparse, their margins crowded with penciled corrections and warnings. Impassable, collapsed, contested. In the Vimy sector, east of Arras, entire villages were reduced to coordinates and memory. What remained stood by accident. On March 28, 1917, an engineer patrol from the Canadian Corps filed a routine note during a night survey. The entry was brief and technical, the sort of thing clerks rarely read twice. Stone religious ruin located approximately 280 meters forward of trench line. Structure intact beyond expectation. No tactical value observed. The note was logged at 2:40 hours and stamped without comment. 2 days later, another patrol referenced the same ruin. This time, the tone shifted. The measurements were more careful. The distances repeated. The location, between Arras and Lens, southeast of Givenchy-en-Gohelle, was identical. But the final line differed. Men request clarification regarding the site. There was no clarification to give. The ruin stood on what had once been a minor farm track, a pre-war route not important enough to warrant a name on most maps. According to cadastral records last updated in 1912, the area supported a handful of stone buildings and a roadside chapel maintained by local families. By 1915, the hamlet no longer existed. By 1916, even its name had disappeared from official print. The chapel remained. Those who saw it described a structure that should not have survived. The walls were thick, unusually so for a rural devotional building, set with limestone blocks, cut in a style inconsistent with nearby 19th century construction. There was no visible cross, no bell tower. The roof had collapsed inward, yet the apse stood firm, its stonework intact despite 3 years of artillery saturation in the sector. Most chapels on the Western Front were obliterated within weeks. This one endured. On March 30th, an infantry private, name redacted in the surviving copy, entered the ruin during a lull in shelling. He remained inside for 11 minutes. When he returned to his section, his hands no longer shook. According to the platoon medic, the man had suffered from persistent tremors since October 1916, following burial during a bombardment near Thiepval. That night, he declined his ration of rum. By March 31st, word had spread. Men did not speak of miracles. They did not speak of God. They spoke instead of quiet, of a place where the pressure behind the eyes eased, where the noise, constant, mechanical, inescapable, seemed to recede by degrees, as if obeying a boundary no shell could cross. The visits were unrecorded at first. No orders were issued, no permission granted. Soldiers went alone or in pairs, crossing the torn earth of no man's land during ceasefires that were never formalized and never acknowledged. In the radius surrounding the ruin, later estimated at approximately 90 to 110 meters, rifle fire diminished. Machine guns fell silent for minutes at a time. Observers on both sides noted the same anomaly without coordination. Between April 2nd and April 5th, 11 men entered the chapel. All returned. None reported fear. Several reported a sensation described, independently, as being expected. Medical notes from the period are fragmentary, but consistent. The battalion aid post recorded a temporary reduction in anxiety-related symptoms among those men. Heart rates normalized. Sleep improved. Requests for sedatives dropped to 0 for 48 hours following each visit. No explanation was offered. On April 6th, the first fatality occurred. A corporal, who had entered the chapel the previous evening, was killed during a routine wiring patrol at 22:10 hours. The engagement was minor. No significant enemy fire was reported. When daylight came, the body was not recovered. Search parties found no remains, no blood trail, no equipment. The man's rifle was later discovered leaning against the outer wall of the chapel, clean and unloaded. By April 18th, 34 soldiers had entered the ruin. All returned to duty. 12 were subsequently declared killed in action. 12 bodies were never recovered. The pattern might have gone unnoticed. Another statistical irregularity in a war defined by them, if not for the letters. The first arrived in mid-April, addressed to a woman in Lille. It bore a field postmark dated April 14, 1917, 3 days after the official date of the sender's death. The handwriting matched earlier correspondence. The paper was standard issue. The ink had not faded. "I am calm now," the letter read. "Do not worry for me. I have already given what was asked." 6 more letters followed over the next 3 weeks. Different hands, different recipients, the same tone. None referenced combat. None mentioned wounds. All expressed relief. Postal officers flagged the anomaly. Command dismissed it as delayed routing compounded by clerical error. No formal investigation was opened. On May 3rd, a military chaplain visited the site at the request of an infantry officer. His report survives only as a paraphrase in a later memorandum. He noted the absence of Christian iconography, the unusual orientation of the altar, and a carved recess in the stone that did not correspond to any recognized liturgical function. He declined to consecrate the ruin. "I did not feel threatened," he reportedly said. "I felt acknowledged." The final incident occurred during the night of May 21-22, 1917. 9 soldiers entered the chapel shortly after dusk. They were seen by multiple witnesses. At dawn, the ruin was sealed from the inside. No sound came from within. Engineers forced entry at 06:15 hours. There were no bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. 9 rifles were stacked neatly against the inner wall. On June 3rd, artillery was ordered to destroy the structure. 2 direct hits were confirmed. The outer walls collapsed. The apse remained. After the war, the area was declared unsafe for resettlement. The maps were redrawn again. The chapel did not appear on them. But those who passed through the Vimy sector after 1919 spoke of a place the animals avoided, where the ground felt hollow underfoot, and where footsteps could sometimes be heard at night, measured, disciplined, and unwavering, as if a watch was still being kept. By early April 1917, survival on the Western Front depended on predictability. Men learned the rhythms of artillery. They learned which shells meant advance and which meant warning. They learned how long a parapet would last under sustained fire and how deep a dugout had to be to feel, briefly, safe. Structures that defied these patterns did not go unnoticed. The chapel was one of them. It stood approximately 280 meters forward of the Canadian trench line, measured on April 2, 1917, by a 2-man engineering detail assigned to assess ground stability ahead of a planned wiring operation. The measurement was repeated twice, using different reference points, and recorded in pencil on a field map that no longer survives. What does remain is the typed summary prepared later that morning. Stone structure remains intact beyond statistical expectation for the sector. That phrase, statistical expectation, was not common language for infantrymen or engineers. It suggests comparison, calculation, an awareness that the ruin should, by all available data, have been destroyed. The surrounding area had not been spared. Shell craters overlapped, some filled with water. Others collapsed into one another, forming irregular trenches where the ground could no longer decide whether it was earth or absence. Timber supports lay splintered and half-buried. Iron fragments were embedded in the soil at angles that spoke of repeated impacts from different directions. According to artillery logs, the grid square had absorbed over 1,200 shells between October 1914 and March 1917, including heavy calibers capable of leveling reinforced stone. And yet the chapel stood. Its walls measured between 90 and 110 centimeters thick, depending on the section. Unusual for a rural devotional building. The limestone blocks showed no uniform pattern typical of 19th-century French village construction. Instead, they varied slightly in size, fitted together with a precision that suggested older techniques or later reinforcement. No maker's marks were visible. No cornerstone bore a date. More notably, there was no cross. Infantrymen noticed this first. In a war saturated with improvised symbols, helmets nailed to posts, rifles stuck muzzle down in the mud to mark graves, the absence of an obvious religious sign was striking. Chapels without crosses existed, but they were rare and typically documented. This one was not. The entrance faced north-northwest, deviating from the traditional eastward orientation common to Christian altars. Inside, the roof had collapsed inward sometime before 1916, judging by vegetation growth on the fallen beams. Yet, the apse, the semicircular end of the structure, remained intact. Its stone surface was smoother than the rest of the interior, worn not by weather, but by repeated contact. Hands, perhaps. The first recorded entry occurred on April 2nd at approximately 1920 hours. The soldier's name appears in one copy of a battalion diary, but was later struck through in ink. According to the account, he entered alone during a lull in shelling that lasted 14 minutes. A sentry watched him cross the open ground and noted no incoming fire during that interval from either side. When the man returned, he did not speak immediately. He sat on the fire step, removed his helmet, and remained still for nearly a minute. This detail appears in two separate recollections recorded months later, and is therefore treated with caution. What is corroborated is the medical note entered later that night. The battalion aid post log, dated April 2nd, lists the soldier as having presented previously with persistent tremor, insomnia, and agitation. On that date, the medic added a short addendum. Symptoms temporarily absent. Patient declined rum ration. The decline of alcohol was significant. Rum was not merely a comfort. It was a sanctioned coping mechanism, distributed daily in forward areas. Refusing it was uncommon, and often noted as a sign of shock or illness. In this case, no further comment was made. Over the next 72 hours, 10 more men entered the chapel. They did so without coordination. No officer ordered it. No group went together. Each man crossed alone or, in two cases, with a single companion who remained outside. The durations varied, from 7 minutes at the shortest to 19 at the longest. But the pattern of behavior upon return was similar enough to draw quiet attention. Hands steadied. Speech slowed. Several men slept through the night without interruption for the first time in weeks. On April 3rd, a platoon commander noted in his private journal, "The men are calmer. I cannot say why. It does not feel earned." Such remarks were not intended for official record. They survived because personal diaries were often preserved where formal reports were lost. The engineers returned on April 4th to take additional measurements. They noted that the interior temperature of the chapel felt cooler than the surrounding air, despite the mild spring weather. No thermometer was available, but both men independently remarked on the difference. They also observed that sound behaved strangely within the structure. Voices did not echo. Footsteps seemed muted, absorbed by the stone. One engineer wrote later, "It was as if the place had already heard enough." That line did not appear in his official statement. The absence of iconography became a point of discussion. There were no saints, no inscriptions in Latin or French, no remnants of painted walls. Instead, the apse contained shallow carvings, recesses rather than symbols, arranged in a pattern that repeated 3 times along the curve of the stone. They resembled niches, though too small to hold statues. Their edges were worn smooth. A chaplain attached to a neighboring unit was informed of the structure on April 5th. He did not visit immediately. His delay would later be cited as a missed opportunity, though at the time it seemed inconsequential. Chaplains were overextended, responsible for hundreds of men spread across unstable positions. A nameless ruin in no man's land did not rank highly. By the evening of April 5th, the count stood at 11 visitors. All had returned. None reported visions. None claimed divine intervention. When asked directly, several men struggled to articulate what they had experienced. One said only that the noise stopped. Another described a sensation, like setting something down after carrying it too long. The language was imprecise. The effect was not. At 22:10 hours that night, during a routine wiring patrol, one of the men who had entered the chapel was killed. The engagement was minor. Enemy fire was brief and inaccurate. When the patrol withdrew, his body was not recovered. This was not unusual. What was unusual was where his equipment was found. The following morning, his rifle, clean, unloaded, and undamaged, was discovered leaning against the outer wall of the chapel. No one admitted to placing it there. No tracks led away from the spot. The ground, churned by months of shelling, held no clear impressions. By the end of the week, the chapel had become a subject of quiet avoidance and quiet attraction in equal measure. Men did not gather around it. They did not speak of it openly. But when lulls came, those fragile, unofficial pauses that dotted the Western Front, figures could be seen moving toward the ruin, one at a time, heads lowered, weapons left behind. Officers noticed. They said nothing. War tolerated many irregularities. This one, at first, seemed harmless, perhaps even useful. A calmer soldier held his position better. A man who slept was less likely to break. No one yet asked what the chapel required in return. That question would come later. Silence on the Western Front was never absolute. Even during lulls, the earth spoke. Distant guns, the creak of timber, the low percussion of shells falling miles away. Silence was a thinning, not an absence. And yet, beginning on April 6, 1917, something changed around the chapel. Observers first noticed it in fragments. A sentry on the Canadian line recorded a 9-minute gap in small arms fire directly opposite his post between 03:12 and 03:21 hours. He did not mark it as a ceasefire. There was no agreement, no white flags, no movement to retrieve wounded. He simply noted that the usual crackle was missing. The following night, a British unit to the south logged a similar interval, approximately 11 minutes, in which both sides remained still. By April 8th, the phenomenon had a shape. Field notes collected after the war suggest a radius of reduced fire extending roughly 90 to 110 meters from the chapel, depending on wind and visibility. Beyond that distance, the war resumed its ordinary cadence. Inside it, men behaved differently. Rifles were lowered. Voices dropped. Orders were given by hand signals rather than shouted commands. No officer issued a directive to this effect. None could have enforced it across enemy lines even if they had tried. The restraint appeared mutual and unspoken, observed by soldiers who had no shared language and no shared command. It was not peace. It was something narrower. On April 9th, the count of visitors reached 17. The pattern of entry remained consistent. Men approached alone or in pairs, left their weapons outside, and entered the chapel briefly. Those who waited outside reported a sensation of pressure, described later as a fullness in the chest, that eased only after their companion emerged. No one crossed the threshold unwillingly. No one was forced back. Medical observations grew more specific. The battalion aid post began tracking heart rates and sleep duration for men who volunteered the information. Over a 10-day span, those who had visited the chapel showed a measurable reduction in resting pulse, average decrease, 812 beats per minute, fewer reported nightmares, and a temporary absence of what doctors then called battle agitation. The improvement did not last indefinitely. After 4 to 6 days, symptoms began to return, unless the man visited again. This detail did not appear in official reports. It survived in marginal notes and post-war interviews, often dismissed by the speakers themselves as coincidence. Still, the repetition is notable. By April 11th, officers began to worry, not because the men were afraid, but because they were not. Calm, in a war that demanded constant vigilance, could be dangerous. A soldier too at ease might expose himself unnecessarily. He might fail to react quickly enough. Or worse, he might volunteer for tasks that others avoided. That last possibility materialized sooner than expected. On April 12th, a wiring party assembled at dusk. The assignment was routine and hazardous, involving exposure to machine gun fire from a known enemy position. Before the officer could designate men, 3 volunteers stepped forward, all of whom had visited the chapel within the previous 48 hours. The patrol went out at 21:05 hours. Enemy fire was sporadic and inaccurate. 2 men returned uninjured. The third was hit and fell forward into a shell crater. When dawn came, his body was not found. This marked the 4th fatality among chapel visitors, whose remains could not be recovered. It was around this time that soldiers began to describe a shared quality in the aftermath of visits. Not a thought or a belief, but a sensation. Men spoke of having set something down, of having paid already. The language varied, but the implication was consistent. Whatever fear the war demanded, it had been addressed. The chapel did not inspire courage in the conventional sense. It did not inflame. It quieted. Enemy observers noticed the change as well. A German report captured after the war references a stone ruin near the forward area where firing diminishes without command. The document offers no explanation and does not assign blame. It is a single paragraph, undated, included among unrelated field notes. That it exists at all suggests the phenomenon crossed the lines without crossing the language barrier. On April 14th, the first letter arrived. It was delivered through ordinary channels to a civilian address in Lille, bearing a field postmark dated 3 days after the sender's official death. The handwriting matched earlier correspondence held by the family. The paper was standard issue. The ink showed no signs of age or exposure. The letter did not mention combat. "Do not be afraid for me," it read. "The noise has stopped. I was ready and that was enough." Postal officers flagged the inconsistency and forwarded the envelope to a superior. The matter was resolved administratively. Delays happened. Clerical errors happened. In a system strained by war, anomalies were absorbed rather than examined. 6 more letters followed between April 15th and April 28th. Different hands, different destinations, the same absence of detail. None described wounds. None referenced fear. All conveyed relief. By April 16th, the number of visitors reached 26. That night, a patrol reported seeing figures standing near the chapel after midnight, still, upright, and evenly spaced. The observation lasted only seconds before a flare went up elsewhere along the line, drawing attention away. No follow-up was conducted. The chaplain arrived on April 17th. He approached in daylight, accompanied by an infantry lieutenant and 2 men assigned to remain outside. He did not pray upon entry. He did not bring vestments or holy water. According to his later recollection, he wished first to understand the place as it was. Inside, he noted the same absences others had described. No cross, no altar cloth, no scripture. The stone recesses in the apse drew his attention. He ran his hand along one of them and withdrew it quickly, not in fear, but in surprise. It was warm, he said later, not hot, alive. He did not perform a consecration. When asked why, he offered a reason that unsettled his superiors. Consecration is for places that await something. This place has already received what it expects. The statement was not recorded verbatim in any official file. It survived through repetition, passed from officer to officer, often prefaced with disbelief. By April 18th, 34 men had entered the chapel. All had returned. Within the same period, 7 were declared killed in action. 7 bodies were not recovered. Their equipment was found intact. Rifles clean, boots unlaced, personal items arranged with a care that suggested intention rather than chaos. The shared silence around the chapel persisted. It did not spread. It did not grow. It remained contained, as if bound by an unseen perimeter. Men learned its edge instinctively. They lowered their voices as they crossed it. They avoided sudden movements. Even artillery seemed to hesitate, shells falling short or wide with improbable consistency. Command did not intervene. In the calculus of war, anything that steadied men without disrupting operations was tolerated, perhaps even welcomed. No one yet connected the silence with the absence of bodies, or with the letters that continued to arrive, dated beyond death. That connection would become impossible to ignore soon enough. For now, the chapel remained what it appeared to be, a ruin with no tactical value, a quiet pocket in a loud war, and a place where fear went in and did not come back out. The Western Front produced mountains of paper, orders, casualty lists, ration tallies, supply requests. Documents moved constantly between the front and the rear, stamped, countersigned, corrected, and often forgotten. Letters were different. They were not meant to return. When the first postmarked envelope arrived after its sender's death, it was treated as an inconvenience rather than a mystery. Field post was imperfect. Dates were misread. Bags were misrouted. In the chaos of war, coincidence was not only possible, it was expected. The problem was that coincidence began to repeat itself. By April 19th, 3 letters had arrived, all bearing dates that fell 2 to 5 days after the recorded deaths of the men who signed them. Each passed through different sorting offices. Each followed a different route. None showed signs of delay consistent with weeks-old mail finally catching up to a unit's movement. Postal clerks compared the handwriting. It matched. This was not unusual in isolation. Handwriting could be forged, mimicked, or misremembered. But in every case, families confirmed the letters as genuine. The phrasing was familiar. The turns of expression were intimate. One mother in Amiens reportedly remarked that her son had always written like that, as if explaining something simple to someone frightened. The content was restrained, almost deliberately so. None of the letters described violence. None mentioned blood, shelling, or fear. Several referenced quiet in indirect ways. It is easier to think now. I am not afraid anymore. I stood somewhere and felt finished. The most unsettling detail was not what the letters said, but what they omitted. There were no requests for news, no questions, no sense of an unfinished conversation. Each letter read like a closing statement, rather than correspondence. Military censors reviewed the envelopes as a matter of protocol. Nothing in the text violated regulations. There were no coordinates, no troop movements, no criticism of command. The letters were released. By April 22nd, officers began cross-referencing casualty reports with postal logs. The overlap was too precise to ignore. Of the 12 men declared killed in action after visiting the chapel, 7 had sent letters dated after their deaths. The remaining 5 had no surviving correspondence, or had been listed as missing rather than confirmed dead. That distinction mattered. Men listed as missing were afforded a liminal status. Their names remained in circulation longer. Their belongings were not immediately redistributed. Hope lingered in administrative form. But the letters did not come from the missing. They came from the dead. On April 24th, an officer attempted to trace the origin of one letter more closely. The envelope bore a standard field postmark, but the ink impression showed irregular pressure, lighter at the edges, heavier at the center, as if applied slowly rather than struck. The paper showed no creasing consistent with long transit. It had not been folded and unfolded repeatedly. It appeared handled only once. The officer noted this in a memorandum that would later be misfiled under supply discrepancies. Around this time, men began to speak more openly, though still quietly, about what they felt inside the chapel. They did not describe visions. There were no voices, no commands, no promises. Instead, they spoke of a sense of completion, of a moment in which fear ceased to function. One infantryman described it as remembering something you had already agreed to. Another said simply, "It knows." Such language alarmed some officers, who attributed it to stress and suggestion. War bred superstition. Soldiers sought patterns where none existed. The chapel, they reasoned, had become a focal point for psychological relief, no different from a lucky charm or a ritualized behavior. The difference lay in the outcome. On April 27th, a patrol returned with 2 wounded men and 1 fatality. The dead soldier had visited the chapel 3 days prior. When the patrol withdrew, his body could not be recovered. That night, his personal effects, knife, compass, and a folded photograph, were found arranged on the chapel's inner ledge, directly beneath one of the stone recesses. No one claimed responsibility for placing them there. The arrangement was not chaotic. The objects were aligned, clean. The photograph had been wiped of mud. This marked the first time personal items appeared inside the chapel after a death. The chaplain was informed. He visited again on April 29th, alone. He did not remain long. When he returned, he declined to write a formal report. Instead, he requested a transfer to another sector. His request was denied due to manpower shortages. He remained visibly unsettled and ceased discussing the chapel entirely. The letters continued. By May 1st, there were 10 confirmed cases of posthumous correspondence linked to chapel visitors. The dates varied. The phrasing remained consistent. Each letter suggested an exchange had taken place. Something given, something received. One letter, addressed to a younger brother in Roubaix, contained a line that was later quoted repeatedly among the men. "Tell father not to worry. I did not leave anything unpaid." That sentence circulated along the trench line faster than any official notice. Soldiers repeated it under their breath before patrols. Some laughed it off. Others avoided the chapel entirely afterward. Not all who entered died. This fact complicated any attempt at explanation. Of the 34 visitors recorded by May 3rd, 22 remained alive and on duty. They did not deteriorate. They did not exhibit signs of possession or madness. If anything, they appeared more focused, more precise. They volunteered for dangerous tasks and returned unscathed. This inconsistency troubled command more than uniform catastrophe would have. If the chapel killed indiscriminately, it could be destroyed without hesitation. But it did not. It selected, or appeared to. Engineers attempted a structural explanation. They suggested the ruin might shelter unexploded ordnance or emit gases that affected perception. Tests were inconclusive. No unusual residues were found. Air circulation was normal. The stone itself showed no chemical anomalies. By May 5th, an informal rule had emerged among the men. Do not go twice. Those who had entered once avoided returning. When asked why, they struggled to answer. Several said they felt no need. Others said they felt watched when they approached again, not threatened, but reminded. The second visit, they believed, would be different. On May 7th, the letters stopped for 3 days. This pause unsettled those who had come to expect them. It was interpreted irrationally as a sign of displeasure. On May 10th, 2 men entered the chapel together, breaking the established pattern. They remained inside for 27 minutes, longer than any previous visit. Neither returned. Their bodies were not found. Their equipment was discovered neatly stacked outside the entrance, as if prepared in advance. That night, artillery fire resumed in full around the chapel's perimeter. Shells fell close enough to collapse sections of the outer wall. The apse remained intact. On May 12th, letters resumed. Two arrived. Both were dated that same day. Both contained nearly identical phrasing, though written by different hands. "It is finished now. Please do not come looking." Command could no longer ignore the pattern. On May 15th, a directive was issued restricting access to the ruin. Guards were posted. Engineers were ordered to prepare demolition plans. The chapel was, at last, formally recognized, not as a place of comfort or superstition, but as an anomaly, a problem. By then, it had already taken what it needed. The letters ceased entirely after May 15th. No explanation was recorded. What remained was the silence, heavier now, no longer shared willingly. Men avoided the area. Animals skirted it. Even artillery observers noted that shells tended to fall short or wide, as if the grid itself resisted correction. The chapel did not ask for belief. It did not demand prayer. It accepted fear, and it marked those who had already decided what they were willing to give in return. By mid-May, the chapel was no longer approached casually. Men slowed as they neared it. Conversations ended several meters out, as if the air itself imposed restraint. Guards posted on May 15th followed their orders without complaint, though none could later explain why they preferred to stand farther from the ruin than regulations required. The chapel did not invite proximity. It permitted it. On May 16th, 1917, a formal inspection was conducted. Present were two engineers, a battalion intelligence officer, and the chaplain who had first refused consecration weeks earlier. The stated purpose was architectural assessment prior to demolition. The unstated purpose was understanding, though no one used the word. The altar dominated the apse. It was not raised in the Christian fashion. There was no table, no cloth, no evidence of candle placement. Instead, the stone floor rose gently toward a recessed semicircle carved directly into the wall. The curvature was precise, the surface smooth, polished by contact rather than tools. Engineers estimated the recess had been shaped long before the surrounding masonry, then incorporated into the structure rather than added later. This alone was unusual. The stone niches, 3 of them, were arranged at equal intervals along the curve. Each was approximately 38 centimeters wide, 24 centimeters deep, and worn smooth at the inner edge. Too small for statues, too deliberate to be decorative. Their interiors bore faint discolorations, inconsistent with soot or water damage. One engineer suggested repeated handling. Another suggested kneeling. The chaplain said nothing. There were no inscriptions, no dates, no Latin, no French, no vernacular script of any kind. The absence of language was itself a feature. Most religious structures, even the most modest, bore words, names, prayers, dedications. Here, there was only form. When asked to identify the altar's orientation, the chaplain paced it out himself. He confirmed what others had suspected. It did not face east, nor west. The alignment was slightly offset, north-northwest, toward a direction that held no religious significance in Christian tradition. But it did correspond to something else. Later analysis suggested the altar aligned roughly with the lowest point of the ridge, a depression where groundwater collected and shell craters pooled. In practical terms, it pointed toward the place where the earth was weakest. The chaplain broke his silence then. "This is not an altar of offering," he said. "It is an altar of reception." The phrase unsettled those present. It implied passivity on the part of the structure, and activity on the part of those who approached it. An inversion of expected roles. The intelligence officer asked directly whether the chapel could be consecrated, neutralized, or otherwise rendered inert. The chaplain declined again. "Consecration assumes a vacancy," he replied. "This place is not vacant." He offered no theological framework. He did not invoke demons or heresy. His objection was practical, almost procedural. One does not bless a thing that is already functioning according to its own rules. The inspection continued. Engineers noted that the altar stone was warmer than the surrounding walls. Not hot, not even warm in the human sense, but distinct. The difference was subtle enough that instruments might have missed it, had any been available. It was the kind of variation only a hand could register. When one engineer placed his palm flat against the stone, he withdrew it after several seconds, not in fear, but discomfort. He later described the sensation as being pressed back. No marks were left on the stone, no residue on his skin. The chaplain approached last. He did not touch the altar. He stood within arm's length and closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he stepped back and removed his helmet. This small gesture, unnecessary, instinctive, was noted by everyone present. "It does not want prayer," he said. "It wants acknowledgement." That word appeared again. Acknowledgement, in theological terms, is not worship. It is recognition without submission. The chaplain could not explain why the distinction mattered here, only that it did. Over the next 4 days, no one entered the chapel. This was the longest period of avoidance since its discovery. The guards remained. Demolition plans were drafted but delayed due to artillery priorities elsewhere along the ridge. The chapel stood untouched, patient. During this pause, the effects among previous visitors became more pronounced. Men who had entered once reported a growing sense of detachment, not from duty, but from consequence. They performed tasks efficiently and without complaint. They took risks without bravado. Several volunteered for patrols that traditionally required coercion or rotation. Medical officers observed a troubling trend, a flattening of affect. The men were not numb. They were calm, too calm. One doctor wrote privately, "They behave as if something has already concluded for them, as if outcomes no longer apply." Sleep patterns changed. Those men slept deeply, dreamlessly, and woke without the disorientation common to frontline rest. Nightmares were rare. So were expressions of anticipation. When asked whether they feared death, several answered variations of the same phrase. That part is done. The implication was never elaborated. On May 19th, the chaplain was summoned again, this time alone. A sentry reported hearing voices inside the chapel shortly after dusk. Not shouts, not prayer. Conversation, measured and calm, though no one had entered. The chaplain approached at 20:40 hours. He stood at the threshold and listened. He later insisted there had been no voices, only the sensation of presence, of something attentive. He did not cross inside. Instead, he addressed the altar aloud. What he said was never recorded. What is known is that he spoke in plain language, not liturgy. He did not invoke scripture. He did not command or beseech. According to the sentry, his tone was even, almost administrative. When he finished, he waited. Nothing happened. The chaplain left the chapel and reported to command that night. He did not recommend immediate destruction. He did not recommend preservation. He said only this: "It is not hostile. It is transactional." That assessment shifted the calculus. A hostile structure could be destroyed without hesitation. A neutral one could be ignored. A transactional one required caution. If the chapel took something in exchange for something else, then destruction might not end the exchange. It might merely alter its terms. Command postponed demolition again. On May 20th, the chaplain submitted a formal request for reassignment. This time, it was granted. He departed the Vimy sector within 48 hours. He did not speak of the chapel again, even after the war. In later interviews, he refused to answer questions related to 1917. When pressed, he offered a single statement: "It was not evil, it was exact." That night, May 20th to May 21st, 9 men entered the chapel. They did so deliberately. They went together. This broke every unspoken rule that had developed around the place. They carried no weapons. They left their equipment outside in neat rows. A sentry watched them enter and did not stop them. No one saw them leave. By morning, the chapel door was closed from the inside. When engineers forced entry at 06:15 hours, they found the interior unchanged, the altar untouched, the niches empty. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle or panic, only absence. This was the moment when the chapel ceased to be tolerated. Orders were issued that afternoon. Artillery was assigned. The ruin would be erased. But whatever the chapel had been built to do, whatever rules governed its exchange, it had already demonstrated one thing with clarity. It did not belong to the war, and the war did not fully apply to it. The 9 men entered the chapel just after dusk on May 21, 1917. There was no urgency to their movement, no whispered debate. They crossed the torn ground in a loose file, spaced evenly, as if following a drill rehearsed long before the war. A sentry counted them, once, then again, because something about their pace suggested intention rather than impulse. Each man stopped at the threshold. Weapons were placed on the ground first, rifles aligned parallel to the outer wall, muzzles turned away from the entrance. Ammunition pouches were unbuckled and set beside them. Helmets were stacked, 3, then 3, then 3, carefully balanced to avoid collapse. Only then did they step inside. The sentry noted the time, 20:18 hours. At 20:26, the wind shifted. Smoke from distant shelling drifted across the ridge, lowering visibility. At 20:31, artillery fire resumed along adjacent sectors. None of it landed within the chapel's immediate perimeter. This was not unusual. The night's bombardment was scattered and indecisive. At 20:47, the chapel door closed. No one could later say who closed it. The door had not been observed in motion. There was no creak, no slam, no sound of wood on stone. One moment it stood ajar, warped and hanging at an angle from shell damage. The next it was shut, firmly enough that light no longer spilled from within. The sentry did not investigate. He would later explain that it did not occur to him to do so. The closure felt conclusive, like an ending that did not invite interruption. Throughout the night, guards remained at their posts. No movement was observed around the chapel. No voices were heard. No light appeared through cracks or openings. Flares, launched elsewhere along the line, briefly illuminated the ruin, revealing nothing out of place. At 04:50 hours, a runner was dispatched to check the site. He approached to within 15 meters, stopped, and returned without reaching the door. When asked why, he struggled to answer. "It felt finished," he said, like knocking after a meeting had already ended. At 06:15 hours, engineers were ordered to force entry. They expected bodies. The door resisted at first, not because it was locked in any conventional sense, but because the frame had settled. When it gave way, it did so without splintering, as if releasing pressure rather than breaking. The interior was unchanged. The altar stood intact. The niches were empty. There were no footprints in the dust, no signs of struggle, no blood. The air was cool and still. The floor bore no marks indicating exit or movement after the door closed. The 9 men were gone. No bodies were ever recovered. This marked the largest single disappearance associated with the chapel, and the moment when coincidence could no longer be invoked. Command reacted swiftly. By 10:30 hours, a directive was issued authorizing the chapel's destruction. Artillery was reassigned from a secondary objective and placed on standby. Engineers were instructed to map the surrounding ground to ensure no unexploded ordnance would compromise the operation. The decision was pragmatic. The chapel was now classified as a hazard, not because it posed a tactical threat, but because it undermined predictability. War could tolerate superstition. It could not tolerate a structure that altered behavior without command. The first shell landed at 21:02 hours on May 22nd. It struck the outer wall, collapsing a section of stone and scattering debris across no man's land. Dust rose, smoke followed. Observers confirmed a direct hit. The second shell followed 2 minutes later, impacting near the apse. When the smoke cleared, the chapel was partially destroyed. The roof remnants collapsed inward. The outer walls fractured. The entrance was obliterated. The apse remained. This was noted immediately. A third shell was fired at 2111, aimed directly at the surviving structure. It struck true. Stone cracked. Chunks fell away. The curvature of the apse deformed, but did not collapse. Artillery officers requested confirmation of target integrity. Observers reported visible damage, but not total destruction. The order was given to cease fire pending reassessment. That night, something else happened. Men reported dreams, not nightmares. Those were common and rarely discussed, but dreams of a specific kind. Calm, structured, repetitive. Several men independently described standing in a stone space, facing a curved wall, aware of others behind them but unable to turn. No voices spoke. No commands were given. All reported waking without fear. Medical officers dismissed the accounts as stress-related contagion, shared suggestion, the power of proximity. Still, the coincidence was troubling. Every man who reported the dream had either entered the chapel previously or stood guard near it. On May 23rd, engineers approached the ruin again. They found the rifles still where they had been placed, untouched by shelling, clean despite debris scattered around them. The helmets remained stacked. The ammunition pouches lay closed, their contents intact. The arrangement had not shifted. That afternoon, a patrol discovered something new. Approximately 12 meters from the apse, beneath a shallow layer of disturbed soil, they found a cluster of personal effects. A watch stopped at 2047, a folded letter never sent, a regimental badge polished to brightness. The items were not buried deeply. They appeared placed rather than lost. There were 9 items, 1 for each man. Command sealed the area. Between May 24th and May 27th, no one was permitted within 50 meters of the ruin. Sentries were rotated frequently, as several reported discomfort when stationed too close for extended periods. Animals, rats, stray dogs, avoided the cordon entirely. During this period, letters resumed. 3 arrived on May 25th, each addressed to different recipients, each bearing the same date. The phrasing differed, but the sentiment aligned. It is complete. The exchange has ended. Do not return. The dates match the night of the disappearance. Command intercepted the letters and halted further delivery. The families would never see them. By May 27th, the decision was made to remove the ruin entirely. Engineers proposed demolition at the foundation level, followed by burial under rubble to prevent access. The plan was approved. Before work began, an intelligence officer visited the site one final time. He stood before the damaged apse and took measurements. He did not record them in his notebook. Instead, he wrote a single sentence on a loose sheet of paper that would later be found among unrelated files. The structure does not defend itself. It endures. Demolition commenced at dawn the following day. Charges were placed. The remaining stone was brought down. The apse fractured at last, collapsing inward and disappearing beneath a mound of debris. The ground was leveled as much as the terrain allowed. The chapel ceased to exist as a structure, but the area did not return to normal. Shells continued to fall short. Footsteps were heard at night. Men avoided the place instinctively, altering patrol routes without instruction. Even after the front moved eastward, the ground was left undisturbed. In the records, the chapel was reduced to a line item: religious ruin, neutralized. In practice, something else had occurred. 9 men had entered a place that accepted fear as currency. They had given what was asked. And when the exchange was complete, there was nothing left to retrieve. Command preferred problems that could be solved with force. By early June, the chapel was no longer visible as a structure. The apse had collapsed. The stones lay scattered and half-buried beneath churned earth. On paper, The anomaly had been eliminated. In practice, the sector continued to behave as if the ruin still stood. Reports accumulated quietly. Artillery observers noted repeated calibration failures when firing across the former site. Shells fell short or drifted wide despite corrected coordinates. The error margin was small, often no more than 30 to 50 meters, but consistent enough to be remarked upon. When batteries adjusted away from the grid square, accuracy returned. Infantry patrols altered routes without orders. When questioned, men struggled to justify the changes. They cited uneven ground, poor cover, or simple habit. Maps showed no such obstacles. The avoidance was instinctive, collective, and unspoken. On June 1st, a formal inquiry was opened. Not into the chapel, but into discipline. Officers were instructed to discourage discussion of the ruin and to treat references to it as manifestations of stress or superstition. Medical staff were reminded that the war produced psychological strain and that coincidence must not be mistaken for causation. The inquiry concluded in 48 hours. Its findings were inconclusive, which in military terms was sufficient grounds for closure. On June 3rd, a final order was issued. The area was to be designated non-essential terrain. No further engineering work would be conducted there. Patrol routes were adjusted on paper to exclude the grid square entirely. In effect, the ground was abandoned without being named as such. The war moved on. Within weeks, the front shifted eastward. New objectives replaced old ones. Units rotated. Men who had known the chapel were killed, wounded, or reassigned. By late summer, few remained who could speak of it firsthand. Those who did rarely did. In personal correspondence that survived the war, references to the chapel were indirect, if present at all. Writers spoke instead of "a place we don't cross" or "the quiet ground." The name, if it had ever had one, was never recorded. Official histories of the Vimy sector make no mention of a religious ruin beyond standard references to destroyed villages and chapels typical of the region. In this sense, the chapel achieved a kind of administrative invisibility. It was not denied. It was omitted. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, the Western Front revealed its aftermath slowly. Survey teams moved across the former battlefields, cataloging craters, marking unexploded ordnance, and identifying areas too unstable for agriculture or resettlement. The Vimy sector was among the first to be assessed, its strategic importance having warranted early reconstruction planning. One grid square was flagged repeatedly. Reports from 1919 described soil instability, inconsistent with shell damage alone. The ground settled unevenly, as if hollowed beneath the surface. Attempts to level it failed. Depressions reappeared after rainfall. No tunnel systems were found. No mines were recorded there in German or Allied logs. Local laborers refused to work the site. They did not cite danger. They cited discomfort. Animals balked at crossing the area. Horses shied. Dogs would not approach. These behaviors were noted in passing and dismissed as superstition. In 1921, a surveyor recorded hearing footsteps while working alone at dusk. He attributed the sound to wind or shifting debris. The entry was struck from his final report by a supervisor concerned with maintaining professional tone. In 1924, a shepherd reported seeing figures standing on the ridge at night, upright, evenly spaced, motionless. He assumed them to be memorial guards and paid them no mind. There were no such guards assigned to the area. By 1926, the ground was classified as unsuitable for development and left fallow. The maps marked it blank. No monument was erected. No names were carved nearby. Families of the 9 men who disappeared on May 21, 1917, received standard notifications. Missing. Presumed dead. No remains were returned. No grave was provided. Their letters, those intercepted after the disappearance, were never delivered and eventually destroyed as part of routine archival reduction. What survived were fragments. A chaplain's refusal to speak. An engineer's note about stone that endured beyond expectation. A handful of private letters written before fear had been removed and replaced with calm. The war ended. The exchange did not. Those who visited the chapel once and lived carried no visible mark. They returned home, aged, worked, raised families. But in interviews decades later, a pattern emerged. When asked about fear, of death, of war, of loss, they hesitated. Several used the same phrasing, unprompted. That part was already settled. They could not explain what they meant. Perhaps the chapel was never meant to be remembered. Perhaps it was built for moments when fear exceeded utility, when armies required men who could act without hesitation, without hope, without resistance. It did not demand belief. It did not promise survival. It offered relief, and accepted payment only from those who were already prepared to give it. In the end, the chapel did not feed on soldiers. It fed on what the war produced in excess. And when the supply ran out, it was no longer needed.